There is a silent tragedy that unfolds in the inner life long before it becomes visible in the outer world. Poverty and ruin do not announce themselves with clamor. They arise from habits of thought, unnoticed impulses, subtle distortions of judgment, and an inner posture toward life that quietly erodes one's stability. Most people imagine poverty solely as a lack of money, but long before financial scarcity appears, there is a poverty of clarity, intention, discipline, and wisdom. Long before someone becomes ruined in their material affairs, there is a ruin of habits, attitudes, and perceptions. Maimonides understood this with unusual precision. In his writings, he rarely treated human misfortune as an accident. Instead, he traced it back to causes within the soul, misplaced desires, confused beliefs, emotional instability, and the absence of moderation. For him, the human being is not ruined by fate, but by an inner disarray that slowly dismantles judgment. Before wealth is lost, reason is lost. Before life collapses, the structure of the mind has already collapsed. The great dilemma of human existence, therefore, is not merely how to avoid external poverty, but how to prevent inner poverty. Many people are unaware that they live with spiritual and intellectual habits that directly attract scarcity, not by mystical forces, but by deep psychological laws that govern action and consequence. Maimonides saw every human being as part of a universe governed by order. When one aligns with that order through wisdom, moderation, and clarity, life tends toward stability. When one resists that order through confusion, excess, and negligence, life falls into disorder. The difficulty is that most of these behaviors operate below conscious awareness. People do not notice that they are creating conditions for their own downfall. They believe life is happening to them, not through them. They imagine the cause of misfortune is external, while the true cause quietly resides in the inner world. This is why Maimonides insisted on self-examination, a rigorous, honest, unflinching observation of one's beliefs, fears, habits, attachments, and motivations. Human beings struggle with a strange blindness. They can see clearly the mistakes of others, yet remain oblivious to the patterns that govern their own misfortune. They feel the pain of consequences, but rarely trace the origin of those consequences within themselves. They wonder why opportunities slip away, why relationships deteriorate, why their efforts bear little fruit, yet they never investigate the silent forces shaping their choices. This blindness is not moral failure, it is a universal human condition, but if left unchallenged, it becomes the root of poverty and ruin. According to Maimonides, the human dilemma begins with a misunderstanding of freedom. Most people equate freedom with the absence of restriction, the ability to act according to impulse, preference, or emotion. But Maimonides argues that true freedom is the disciplined alignment of one's nature with wisdom. A person who is ruled by impulse is not free. He is enslaved by his lower desires. A person who acts without reflection is not free. He is guided by habit, not choice. And a person who refuses to confront uncomfortable truths is not free. He is imprisoned in ignorance. This misunderstanding leads to 7 common behaviors that quietly attract poverty and ruin. They are not dramatic, not criminal, not obvious. They are subtle errors of perception and judgment repeated over time until they become unconscious patterns. Maimonides would say they arise from a deficiency of the intellect and an excess of the passions. They emerge when emotion becomes the ruler of the mind and reason becomes its servant. The tragedy is that these behaviors often appear harmless, even respectable, but the consequences unfold slowly, then suddenly. The first root of ruin is self-deception, the refusal to see one's condition accurately. Many live with illusions about their abilities, their habits, their discipline, or their understanding of the world. They mistake good intentions for action, desire for discipline, opinion for knowledge. They believe they are living rationally when they are actually guided by emotion. Maimonides saw self-deception as a moral disease, capable of destroying a life more effectively than any external enemy. Another root is the neglect of the mind. When people fail to cultivate clarity, knowledge, and understanding, they make impulsive decisions that lead to loss. Poverty often arises from misjudgment, not misfortune. Ruin often follows from ignorance, not accident. Maimonides argues that the intellect is the lamp of the soul. When it is dim, the path becomes dangerous. Then there is emotional excess. Whether through anger, fear, envy, or desire, the unbalanced emotional life distorts perception. It leads to poor timing, poor decisions, self-sabotage, and impulsive behavior. Ruin grows wherever emotional storms are allowed to steer the course of one's actions. There is also the tendency to flee from responsibility, to avoid the difficult work of self-mastery. People often prefer distraction over discipline, entertainment over effort, and comfort over growth. Over time, this quiet preference for ease becomes the silent architect of failure. Maimonides warned that the unwillingness to discipline oneself is not harmless. It is the seed of future sorrow. Another behavior is the misuse of time. Many people spend their hours reactively, without purpose or order, unaware that time is their most valuable resource. Poverty is not only a lack of money, it is a lack of direction. Ruin follows those who treat time casually, who do not structure their days with intention. Finally, there is the absence of moderation. Extremes drain energy, distort judgment, and destroy stability. Whether through overspending, overindulgence, overwork, or overconfidence, excess leads to collapse. Maimonides taught that the middle path is not mediocrity but mastery. These 7 behaviors form the invisible architecture of ruin. They are not external curses, but internal causes. This understanding forms the heart of Maimonides' philosophical depth, the belief that human beings can rise above their condition when they see themselves with clarity and align their lives with wisdom. To understand how these forces operate and how Maimonides would guide us to overcome them, we must now turn to his own writings. Only then can we uncover the philosophical foundations that explain why these unnoticed habits lead to poverty and how one can reverse the process through reason, discipline, and alignment with truth. To understand why certain unnoticed behaviors attract poverty and ruin, one must enter the intellectual world of Maimonides, a world where reason and revelation are not enemies but partners, where human misfortune is not mysterious but traceable to causes, and where the soul is the true architect of one's destiny. Maimonides approached human behavior like a physician of the mind. In his medical writings, he diagnosed physical illness. In the 8 chapters, he diagnosed psychological illness. In the Mishneh Torah, he diagnosed ethical illness. And in the Guide for the Perplexed, he diagnosed metaphysical illness. He believed that every disorder, whether of the body or the soul, arises from imbalance, ignorance, or misalignment with the order of creation. For Maimonides, poverty and ruin were rarely mere accidents. They reflected a deeper disintegration within the individual's intellectual and ethical structure. A person who is inwardly chaotic will eventually experience outward chaos. A person whose mind lacks order will live a life that lacks direction. And a person who avoids discipline will eventually be disciplined by circumstance. His philosophy is built on a simple but profound principle. The external reveals the internal. One of the most striking aspects of Maimonides' thought is his insistence that the human being must constantly examine himself. In the Mishneh Torah, he teaches that the wise person reflects on his actions daily, evaluating whether his emotions, desires, and decisions were aligned with reason. This is not moralizing, it is psychological insight. Those who fail to observe themselves drift unconsciously into patterns that degrade their judgment. And judgment, for Maimonides, is the true foundation of prosperity or ruin. Wealth is not preserved by luck, but by wisdom. Stability is not obtained by chance, but by sound reasoning. Among the 7 unnoticed behaviors that attract poverty, the first and most fundamental in Maimonides' eyes is self-deception. In the Guide for the Perplexed, he observes that the human mind is easily misled not by lies of others, but by lies we tell ourselves. A person believes he is disciplined when he is simply motivated by emotion. He believes he is rational when he is merely repeating habits. He believes he is prudent when he is driven by fear. Maimonides taught that the unexamined belief is the most dangerous force in the human soul. The inability to see oneself clearly leads inevitably to misjudgment, and misjudgment leads to loss. Closely tied to self-deception is the neglect of the intellect. In the Maimonidean worldview, the intellect is not merely a tool for knowledge, it is the essence of the human soul. In the 8 chapters, he argues that the highest virtue is the cultivation of wisdom, because wisdom governs the emotions, moderates desires, and protects the individual from destructive impulses. A person who neglects his intellect becomes prey to confusion, impulse, and superficial thinking. Poverty, he would argue, is often the consequence of an undisciplined mind. Another behavior Maimonides warned against is emotional excess. In his doctrine of the golden mean, he taught that every human emotion has a proper measure. Too little courage becomes cowardice. Too much becomes recklessness. Too little desire becomes apathy. Too much becomes addiction. Too little confidence becomes self-doubt. Too much becomes arrogance. Poverty, in his view, often arises from imbalances of this kind. Recklessness leads to impulsive decisions, while fear leads to missed opportunities. Anger destroys relationships and reputation. Desire leads to overspending. Envy leads to poor judgment. These are not mystical causes. They are rational consequences emerging naturally from emotional imbalance. Maimonides identified another destructive habit, avoidance of responsibility. In Mishneh Torah, he explains that the wise person takes initiative, confronts difficulties, and disciplines himself. The foolish person avoids effort, hides from discomfort, and seeks shortcuts. Ruin follows those who choose comfort over clarity. By refusing to confront their own weaknesses, people create conditions in which those weaknesses eventually punish them. A life built on avoidance is a life without structure, direction, or growth, the fertile ground for collapse. A 5th behavior is the misuse of time. Though Maimonides rarely speaks of time explicitly, his entire method depends on the disciplined use of it. He wrote legal texts, philosophical works, medical treatises, and letters, all while serving as a physician and community leader. His life demonstrates his belief that time is the most valuable resource given to the intellect. A person who wastes time, in his view, is not merely losing hours, he is injuring the development of the soul. Poverty follows those who live reactively without structure, living as though there is always another day to begin the work of wisdom. Another unnoticed behavior he warned against is the absence of moderation. Maimonides taught that every virtue is found in the middle path. Extremes, whether of indulgence or deprivation, lead to destruction. Overspending, overindulgence, or overworking all produce instability. The person who cannot restrain himself eventually exhausts his resources, his energy, his relationships, or his health. Ruin is not immediate. It is cumulative. It begins with small excesses tolerated daily, which eventually grow into forces too strong to control. Finally, Maimonides insisted that a person must continuously seek truth, even when it is uncomfortable. Intellectual laziness, refusal to learn, and attachment to false beliefs were, in his eyes, forms of spiritual poverty. In the Guide, he explains that clinging to unexamined beliefs blinds the intellect and corrupts judgment. Those who refuse to learn cannot adapt, cannot discern opportunities, and cannot correct their errors. Their lives become governed by confusion, and confusion is the quiet architect of ruin. What binds all these behaviors together is a central Maimonidean principle. The human being is responsible for the condition of his soul. External misfortune is real, but it is secondary. The primary cause of human ruin is internal imbalance. Conversely, the primary cause of stability and prosperity is internal order. When the intellect guides the emotions, when reason governs desire, when discipline shapes behavior, and when moderation sets the boundaries of action, life aligns with the order of creation. And where there is order, there is flourishing. For Maimonides, this is not merely psychology, it is spirituality. The human being draws closer to God through the perfection of the intellect and the harmonizing of the soul. Poverty and ruin, therefore, are not only social or economic conditions, they are signs that the soul has deviated from wisdom. To correct them is to return to a life of balance, clarity, and alignment with truth. If we now wish to understand how Maimonides unifies these ideas into a spiritual synthesis, how reason becomes devotion, and how clarity becomes a form of faith, we must proceed deeper into the architecture of his thought. To grasp the full depth of Maimonides' teaching, one must understand that his view of poverty and ruin was never merely economic or social, it was spiritual. For him, the human being is a creature suspended between intellect and impulse, between higher purpose and lower desire, between the clarity of reason and the turbulence of emotion. Ruin occurs when the lower overpowers the higher, and harmony occurs when the higher ascends and governs. This dynamic lies at the center of his entire philosophical project. Maimonides believed that the intellect is not simply a cognitive tool, but a spiritual faculty. It is the bridge between the human being and the divine. In the Guide for the Perplexed, he explains that the more one understands the order of creation, the closer one draws to the Creator. The more one refines the mind, the more one illuminates the soul. The more one learns to govern one's desires, the more one becomes aligned with a higher purpose. Knowledge becomes devotion, clarity becomes worship. For Maimonides, true religion is not a matter of ritual alone, but the transformation of the inner life through understanding. This is why he insisted that the roots of poverty and ruin are internal. When the intellect is neglected, the soul drifts away from its source. When emotions dominate, the inner order collapses. When one lives without moderation, one loses alignment with the natural balance that God imprinted upon the world. The human being becomes fragmented, pulled in many directions, lacking unity of purpose. This fragmentation expresses itself outwardly through financial instability, ruined relationships, poor decisions, and a life that feels chaotic and directionless. But when the inner world is harmonized, the outer world begins to reflect that harmony. This was one of Maimonides' most profound insights. Spiritual alignment has practical consequences. The person whose mind is clear, whose emotions are balanced, and whose desires are disciplined becomes stable, purposeful, and capable of wise judgment. Such a person naturally avoids the 7 behaviors that attract poverty and ruin, not through superstition, but through inner order. For Maimonides, the spiritual life is not opposed to the practical life, it is the foundation of it. The spiritual synthesis he offers begins with self-knowledge. A person must examine the structure of his inner life. He must understand his tendencies, his weaknesses, his strengths, his illusions, and the forces that move him. This process is not for the faint of heart. It requires honesty, humility, and courage. But Maimonides insists that without self-knowledge, one cannot cultivate wisdom. And without wisdom, one is vulnerable to the very behaviors that destroy stability. The second stage of this synthesis is moderation. Maimonides believed that God constructed the world with balance, and that the human being must learn to reflect that balance within himself. The path of virtue is the middle path, the deliberate avoidance of extremes. Moderation is not a restriction, it is freedom. It frees a person from emotional turbulence, impulsive decisions, and the compulsions that lead to ruin. It allows the intellect to guide the soul with clarity and calmness. The third stage is emotional mastery. In the 8 chapters, Maimonides explains that emotions themselves are not the problem. Fear, anger, desire, joy, and sorrow are natural aspects of the human condition. The problem arises when emotions rule the intellect. Emotional excess darkens perception. Anger blinds judgment. Fear paralyzes action. Desire clouds reason. Envy poisons the heart. To master emotion is not to suppress it, but to place it under the guidance of wisdom. When emotions are balanced, they become allies rather than enemies of the intellect. The fourth stage is the cultivation of disciplined action. Maimonides emphasized that knowledge must lead to behavior. Wisdom that remains abstract is incomplete. The soul is shaped by what one does repeatedly. A person who disciplines his actions, his spending, his time, his relationships, his commitments, builds a life of stability. This stability is the natural antidote to poverty and ruin. It is not achieved suddenly, but through consistent alignment of behavior with reason. The fifth stage is the pursuit of truth. For Maimonides, truth is the nourishment of the soul. False beliefs weaken judgment. Intellectual laziness leads to confusion. Attachment to illusions prevents growth. When a person seeks truth through study, reflection, and contemplation, he strengthens the foundation of his inner life. Truth brings clarity, and clarity illuminates the path toward wise decisions. A life built on truth is a life that naturally repels the 7 sources of ruin. Yet the heart of Maimonides' synthesis lies deeper still. He believed that as the intellect is perfected, the soul becomes capable of a higher form of love, the intellectual love of God. This love arises not from emotion, but from understanding. When a person contemplates the order of creation, the beauty of wisdom, the harmony of the universe, and the perfection of divine law, he develops a profound reverence for the Creator. This reverence is not a momentary feeling. It is a way of being. It shapes character, behavior, and perception. This love elevates the human being above the pull of destructive habits. The person who lives with reverence for truth cannot tolerate self-deception. The person who seeks alignment with divine order avoids extremes naturally. The person who understands the consequences of emotional excess cultivates balance. The person who perceives the fragility of life uses time wisely, and the person who sees himself as a steward of divine gifts avoids waste, indulgence, and ruin. In this way, spiritual clarity becomes practical strength. The inner world becomes the architect of the outer world. The soul that is aligned with wisdom creates a life aligned with stability. Poverty, in this view, is not merely absence of wealth, but absence of order. Ruin is not merely collapse of circumstance, but collapse of the soul's clarity. The teachings of Maimonides lead us to transform ourselves from within so that our lives may reflect an order that is timeless, divine, and harmonious. If we wish to translate this profound synthesis into daily practice, into habits, decisions, and ways of living that embody Maimonides' wisdom, we must now explore how his teachings can be lived in the modern world with depth, balance, and clarity. To bring Maimonides' wisdom into modern life, one must learn to translate philosophical clarity into daily action. It is not enough to understand the 7 unnoticed behaviors that attract poverty and ruin. One must replace them with habits of order, moderation, and reason. Maimonides believed that the human being shapes his destiny through patterns repeated over time. Small, consistent acts of alignment transform the soul, and the transformed soul reshapes the course of life. What follows is a practical guide inspired by his teachings, designed to help the modern seeker avoid the subtle forces that create ruin and cultivate the inner structure that leads to stability. The first step is to confront self-deception with radical honesty. Set aside moments each day for self-examination. Ask yourself what beliefs you hold that may not be true. Ask where you are motivated by fear, pride, or desire instead of wisdom. Ask where you may be pretending to be disciplined while relying on impulse. Maimonides taught that truth is the foundation of all virtue. A life built on illusions cannot stand. When you begin to see yourself clearly, without judgment, without denial, without excuses, you lay the groundwork for every other transformation. The second step is to cultivate the intellect. Maimonides believed that the intellect is the lamp of the soul. Without it, the path becomes dark. Set aside time each day for study, not only of information but of wisdom. Read philosophy, history, ethics, and spiritual teachings. Reflect on what you learn. Ask questions. Seek understanding. A cultivated intellect strengthens judgment, clarifies decisions, and protects you from the confusion that leads to ruin. It also trains the mind to think beyond impulse, helping you avoid the emotional excesses that distort perception. The third step is to restore balance to your emotional life. Begin by observing your emotional patterns without fear or avoidance. Notice when you react impulsively, when you feel excess anger, fear, envy, or desire. Notice what triggers these patterns and how they affect your choices. Then practice moderation. When anger arises, pause and breathe before responding. When fear appears, question whether it is based on reality or imagination. When desire becomes excessive, step back and ask whether it aligns with your long-term good. Maimonides taught that virtue is found in the middle path. Emotional mastery comes not from suppression, but from alignment with reason. The fourth step is to embrace responsibility. Avoidance is one of the silent architects of ruin. Begin by facing tasks you tend to delay. Do the difficult things first. Commit to completing what you begin. Hold yourself accountable for your choices. Recognize that no one else is responsible for the condition of your soul. Maimonides believed that freedom is rooted in self-mastery. When you assume responsibility, you reclaim the power to shape your life. The fifth step is to order your time. Time is the canvas of your existence. How you structure it determines the rhythm of your life. Create routines that support clarity, fixed hours for work, for study, for rest, for reflection. Establish priorities and pursue them with discipline. Limit distractions. Protect your attention. Maimonides lived a life of extraordinary productivity, not because he rushed, but because he honored the value of time. A structured day becomes the soil in which stability grows. The sixth step is moderation in all material matters. Maimonides warned that excess, whether of spending, indulgence, or neglect, leads to instability. Evaluate your financial habits. Spend with intention, not impulse. Invest in what strengthens your life, not in what merely gratifies desire. Avoid extremes, neither excessive asceticism nor reckless indulgence. The middle path creates sustainability. Wealth, in Maimonides' view, is not measured by accumulation alone, but by the wisdom with which it is tended. The seventh step is the pursuit of truth. In a world overflowing with noise, misinformation, and superficiality, the search for truth is an act of spiritual courage. Question assumptions. Investigate before believing. Seek clarity in matters of ethics, purpose, and morality. Surround yourself with people committed to honesty and growth. Maimonides believed that truth is a form of divine light. When you align your life with truth, you naturally avoid the illusions that lead to ruin. These 7 practices form the practical foundation of a stable life, yet Maimonides also offers deeper counsel for modern living. One of his most important teachings is the integration of body and mind. A soul seeking clarity cannot dwell in a body that is neglected. Care for your health. Eat with moderation. Move your body. Rest properly. Maimonides wrote extensively about medical practice, recognizing that emotional balance and intellectual clarity depend on physical well-being. Ruin often begins when a person exhausts his body, ignores its needs, or disrupts its natural balance. A healthy body supports a stable mind. Another important principle is the cultivation of humility. Not a humility of self-deprecation, but of perspective. Recognize the limits of your knowledge, the complexity of life, and the vastness of truth. Humility protects you from reckless decisions, from arrogance, and from the illusion of invincibility. It teaches you to listen, to learn, and to grow. Maimonides believed that humility opens the door to wisdom because it dissolves the barriers that prevent the intellect from expanding. Additionally, practice generosity, not necessarily in grand acts, but in the willingness to support others with kindness, time, presence, or material help. Maimonides famously described 8 levels of giving, placing the highest value on empowering others to become self-reliant. Generosity dismantles the inner poverty of selfishness and aligns your soul with abundance. It softens the heart, clarifies intention, and expands your sense of purpose. Another practical teaching is the importance of surrounding yourself with people who elevate your character. Maimonides warned strongly about the corrosive influence of unbalanced company. Choose relationships that encourage wisdom, virtue, and clarity. Distance yourself from those who cultivate chaos, excess, or deception. Your environment shapes your habits, and your habits shape your destiny. Finally, Maimonides offers a quiet but profound meditation. Live with intention. Do not drift. Do not act merely out of habit. Bring awareness into your decisions. Ask yourself what kind of life you are building with each action, each word, each choice. When you live intentionally, you avoid the unconscious behaviors that lead to ruin. You become the architect of your life, rather than its passive witness. At the heart of all these practices lies a single truth, echoed throughout Maimonides' works. The human being was created with the capacity to rise. No matter how entrenched one may be in destructive patterns, no matter how close one may feel to collapse, the path of wisdom is always open. Transformation begins not with dramatic gestures, but with clarity, intention, discipline, and the pursuit of truth. When you align your life with these principles, you dissolve the invisible forces that once attracted poverty and ruin. You create a structure of mind and soul, capable of stability. You become balanced, resilient, and inwardly rich. Maimonides believed that such a life is not only possible, but natural, the fulfillment of what it means to be human.